I'm very happy to be speaking with you, this august community of pan-Arab students and scholars and my Kuwaiti brothers and sisters. Communities abroad, such as this one, have always had a profound impact on the course of things back home. Forums like this are a source of things back home, a source of policy ideas, intellectual camaraderie, and idealism for the future of our country. They are extremely important for our long-term success. Today's seminar, I was told, is innovation and strategy. Innovation is the process of bringing forth into the world new things. Strategy is the ability to chart a course through the world. So today's discussion is about how to respond to new things, which means I can talk about anything. But I want to go beyond buzzwords. Some people say we do market-based analysis, or we want to think about corporate strategy. I've learned that what this means is that you do PowerPoint. There'll be no slides from me today, but I hope we can think about the most important medium-term issue facing our country today, which is the impact of the geopolitics of energy in our region and how we in Kuwait address these challenges through innovation and strategy. First, I'd like to share a true story about something we in the region must deal with every day, and it's interesting because this story I learned it in Professor Mas'oud's class. The year was 1976, and the man was Prince Muhammad bin Faisal Al Saud. Prince Muhammad created a company called Iceberg Transport International. And as the name suggests, he aimed to haul icebergs from Antarctica to the Red Sea. This isn't as crazy as it sounds. Small icebergs are hauled all the time in places like the southern tip of Chile, melted for ice water. But the scale was infinitely bigger. He insisted that he could haul the almost 2-kilometer wide iceberg on an 8,000-kilometer journey in 6 months. All this to slake the kingdom's thirst for fresh water. So desperate for this life-giving water were they that they commissioned a team consisting of a French polar explorer and an engineering firm to assess the feasibility. Needless to say, at great personal cost to himself, Prince Muhammad failed in his endeavor. But today, Prince Muhammad is not synonymous with failure, but for thinking big. That obstacle did not deter him. The same force of will he exhibited is what made him a pioneer of Islamic banking and finance in the region. So when we talk about politics, it is also worth thinking big, not for a particular problem, but as a general attitude. If you think big, you might fail. But then you might just succeed, and if you succeed, you change the world. This is relevant to the Middle East because we know just as the Stone Age did not end for a lack of stone, the Oil Age will not end for a lack of oil. I don't need to tell you the statistics. There's a substantial energy revolution underway. Vaclav Smil, an energy expert, thinks it'll take 25 to 35 years before clean energy goes to 25% of total consumption. Others think it'll be sooner. In that world, there will be abundant oil, and it'll still be used for things like aviation and trucking, but its price will fall. Our biggest customers are already pushing ahead. In Germany, solar panels have already created 38,000 new jobs. In the US, there are twice as many jobs in clean energy than in coal. Success creates its own momentum and its own interest groups. Non-oil producers are pushing harder to wean themselves of oil, in part because of the domestic jobs it'll create. At universities just like this one, there is pressure on the endowment to divest from firms associated with fossil fuels. As a result, we should expect pressures on the oil market to grow. Where does this leave us in Kuwait? The short answer is that it's a profound challenge to our way of doing business. But I must say that I'm heartened by the widespread acceptance of this new reality in most capitals. Everyone knows the oil boom of the last generation expanded the welfare state beyond what is sustainable. The overall budget deficit for oil exporters in MENA went from positive 5% to negative 10% in 2016. Negative 10% is around what the US had during the financial crisis. It is not a normal number, but a crisis number. With oil prices so low, there are only 5 choices: to fund the deficit, borrow more, increase taxes, sell assets, cut spending, or grow the economy. Let's take each one in turn. The state can borrow more in the short term. Gross debt for MENA oil exporters is still low, around 30% of GDP, but it's doubled since 2014. And it's rising quickly, so we can only do this for a few more years. The state definitely has to increase taxes, but if it maintained the same level of public spending, the scale of the tax hike required could drive businesses further away. We can also privatize state assets, but selling the family silver is a very short-term idea. The long-term solutions are cutting the public spending and growing the economy. Cutting the public sector wage bill and social transfers are crucial. We employ far too many of our own citizens in the public sector, anywhere from 40 to 90%. More than any other country on earth, it is simply unsustainable. Cutting spending is also a moral issue. People are essentially adding to the public debt, which allows the current generation to live at the expense of future generations. This is unfair, not least because future generations will not be as lucky as we are. Growing the economy should also be a priority. The oil boom of the last decade benefited the non-tradable sectors over the tradable sectors. As the tide reverses, we will see the effects of the infamous Dutch disease. Basically, capital and people from high productivity petroleum industries will eventually, over decades, have to be deployed in other sectors. We need to know what those sectors are and start planning now. The consequences of failure are tremendous wealth destruction. In his book, Nudge, Professor Cass Sunstein refers to the status quo bias, where loss aversion prevents people from making choices that are in their best interest simply because they're comfortable with the default choice. Continuing the default choice has enormous political and economic consequences. The Las Vegas rule will never apply to our region. What happens in the Middle East never stays in the Middle East. So the fate of the ongoing reforms should be of interest to everyone. Kuwait, this year, will graduate over 30,000 students, and the oil sector can only hire 2,000 of them. 90% of Kuwaitis work in the public sector, and 90% of the people working in the public sector are foreigners. Many are frustrated. There are fewer opportunities than just a few years ago, and the system can be closed to outsiders. I get that. But despite the substantial challenges, I think there are grounds to be optimistic. Put aside the international relations, which is indeed in a kind of crisis with Islamic State, so-called, still in Syria, with Iranian influence running through Tehran, Baghdad, Beirut, and the Qatar crisis in the GCC. Let's look at domestic policy instead. I think in the last few years, there has been a big change in the policy-making climate. Everyone acknowledges the need for reform. At the same time, the failure of the Arab Spring has contained utopian illusions among the public, even in a place like Egypt, where things are really difficult, where, for instance, 90% of the population receives subsidized government bread. People are sticking with it. They're not satisfied per se, but they know protest might lead to something worse. This has opened up space for reform. We are all aware that in the GCC, deep reforms are underway, united by an urge to raise revenues, curb spending, and make the economy more dynamic. In Saudi Arabia, where in the last year, Mohammed bin Salman has proven an effective domestic operator in Saudi politics, consolidating immense power, allowing him to do things that have been historically very difficult. Headlines abroad focus on social reforms, but the main story in Saudi is to build a modern economy, for the first time based on Islamic tourism, mining, and services. In the UAE, substantial electricity, water, and fuel reforms have been enacted. Nationals are for the first time in history paying for water. Peak electricity tariffs were also increased. While there was some dissatisfaction on social media, there was no real backlash. In Kuwait, the reforms are modest, but still important. We raised the price of diesel and kerosene in 2015. And in 2016, oil workers pursued a strike, but the issue has now been resolved. To boost direct investment into the country, the government set up Kadipa, a vehicle to jumpstart direct investment. And they also set up the National SME Fund, worth about $6.5 billion. And it doesn't just give out cash, but it helps entrepreneurs with education and collaboration. The government recently simplified startup costs for new businesses, which we hope will be reflected in our ranking in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, and it has. Innovation also happens in other realms. Take Kuwait's oil industry, for example. Homegrown advances in oil recovery and reservoir management has allowed Kuwait to cover additional 5% more oil than current leading oil producers. Carbon capture, sequestration, and storage is the new frontier, and Kuwait is at the forefront of that space. These are baby steps. More has to come, but they are nevertheless extremely important. Every reform initiative in the world has been greeted with skepticism. Everyone says it can't be done. It won't work, and then it does. At Harvard, our education was about critical thinking, which is about questioning grand narratives. Our education makes us deconstruct, but both construction and deconstruction are important. My suggestion is that at moments when crucial reforms need to happen, they need to be optimistic and create a new national and regional consensus should take precedence. The Stone Age did not end, but it is worth remembering that the ancient civilizations of the Middle East were also the first to enter the Bronze Age. Thank you very much.